I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we hear about the underground network of Russian volunteers helping Ukrainians flee the Russian Federation. We discuss Dominic Nicholls' interview with the Estonian Prime Minister, and I speak to the co-founder of an innovative and unorthodox fundraising effort in aid of the Ukrainian army and other charities, Tear OnlyFans.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 6th of June, day 103. And today I'm joined by Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Camilla Turner, Chief Political Correspondent, and Telegraph correspondent James Kilner, who's calling in from Almaty, Kazakhstan. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. It's been a very busy, long weekend, or a busy weekend in Ukraine. We've not spoken live since last Wednesday. So, quite a bit going on, but in a very localised area. And I mean the Severodonetsk pocket of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region. Russia had been pushing everything they've got, really, to try and close that pocket, to try and take the city of Severodonetsk and close that pocket around the city, which would give them effectively the whole of the Luhansk Oblast. That's the northern region, the northern oblast that makes up the Donbass, the Donetsk, the southern one. So intense fighting there, very much artillery heavy. A point I made last week that's actually been reiterated over the last few days is there's actually quite a small number of Russian tank losses and personnel losses, and what that is indicating either that Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and as I said last week, I don't think that's the case, because otherwise Russia would be making these great breakouts to the west. It may well be, it's likely to be much more indicative that Russia is running out of kit, that it's simply not there. The tanks are not there. We've seen T-62s called up. We think they are running out of kit. But the battle there is one of a very heavy artillery duel. Severodonetsk, the city itself, there were reports at the end of last week that up to 70%, anywhere between 50 and 70% of the city was in Russian hands. That now seems to be going back down. There have been reports that actually this was a very clever Ukrainian trap to cede ground and to draw Russia into that tough urban fight and then hit them. It's far too early to say. You've got to be careful about these hot takes from the ground. It would be wonderful if it was some great operational counterattack born of deception. I don't know if that's the case. I can't sit here hand on heart and say that's what's going on. But it looks like Ukraine is pushing Russia out of the city. Still a sizable minority chunk of that city in Russian hands, but it does seem to be going back, and has not been able to close that gap not been able to push west from Popasna for a couple of weeks now and south from Liman. So very interesting what's happening there in the pocket. Just one other thing there's loads of other things, but I know we've got a busy day today. President Zelensky has visited the area. I mean, he's gone as far as the pocket itself. I don't think he's gone into Severodonetsk city, but certainly into the region, certainly within range of Russian artillery in the area. And I can speak a little bit later about why that is so significant. The only other thing to note for now is that in the last 24 hours, it's been announced that Britain is going to join America in sending multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine. So these are the big artillery pieces out to range of about 80 kilometers, 50 miles. They can fire, the US versions can fire the ATACMS missile, the big sort of 300 kilometre range, but they are the ones that are being sent will not have the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, the ATACMS surface-to-surface missile sent as well, as part of the argument about, well, is it escalatory? Is it too much of a provocation to Russia? Which we can sort of pull apart again a little bit later. But I know we're short for time. I apologise. And just finally, I'm going to make some comments later. I've just been in an interview with Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, very impressive politician. and she is no qualms about it. This is the time for the West and for the world to stand up to Putin. She's saying that escalation, these ideas of escalation, that sending weapons is escalatory. She says this is a trap that Russia have setting the narrative, have we spoken a bit about before. She's also talking about how now that there's the time for the West to decide how much we want this. Sanctions are starting to bite in Russia, and she said sanctions will also then start to bite with us. And we need to decide. She said gas might be expensive, but freedom is priceless. And some very good strategic communication from the Prime Minister. But a bit more of that later.
Thanks, Dom. And we'll also hear from James Kilner, who's calling in from Kazakhstan to tell us about some of his reporting in Estonia recently as well. So he'll join the call in a minute. But first, can I turn to Camilla Turner, the chief political correspondent for the Telegraph? Thanks so much, Camilla, for joining us. The reason we're bringing you on really is Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is in a spot of bother, in quite a lot of trouble, really, today. He's been one of the closest allies of President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Can you tell our listeners what's happening in the UK?
Hi. Yes, thanks very much for having me. I agree with your correction there that a spot of bother is a bit of an understatement for the troubles the Prime Minister is facing today. There's going to be a vote of no confidence scheduled for this evening from 6 till 8 p.m. This is the long-awaited. We've had sort of weeks, months of, won't there be a vote of no confidence? But today's the day that it's all coming to a head. The threshold of the number of letters has been reached, so it's all happening. And today, really, the Prime Minister, along with sort of his Conservative Party headquarters and his allies, are going to spend the day frantically trying to shore up support for him and trying to convince backbench MPs and members of his own government to vote for him, because, of course, the vote is anonymous. So his own cabinet members could be voicing their support on Twitter, could be saying, I'm right behind the Prime Minister, but could then just go and stab him in the back and no one would know. So it's going to be a very frantic day of activity for the Prime Minister, trying to really convince MPs to support him and to support him in this vote this evening.
And this presumably means that the British response to the Ukraine crisis is slightly down in the agenda. Is that the sense you get from talking to people in Westminster?
Well, it's interesting because I actually think, from what we can see so far, some of the key messaging of Boris Johnson's allies as to why it's so important that he stays in the job, that he continues with his sort of policy agenda. The Ukraine war is actually being used as a key plank of this. There was a sort of a briefing document that's been circulated among MPs with some of the key arguments as to why he needs to stay in power. And the Ukraine war features very heavily in that, saying that, the PM is doing this really important job supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. And, that's sort of his main focus. And he needs to be able to continue doing with that. He had a call with Zelensky this morning. That's not uncommon. He speaks to Zelensky quite frequently. But obviously Downing Street have been talking that up quite a lot. It was sort of one of his early social media posts. His third post since the vote being announced was a picture of himself on the phone to Zelensky. So actually, I think what we're likely to see is the Prime Minister really just doubling down on his support for Zelensky and, the role he's playing there, because that's quite a big plank of his argument as to why he should stay in power. He's busy playing this big, important statesman role. And I think what we're likely to see is potentially more announcements, more rhetoric, and as I say, if anything, sort of more support there for Ukraine, because that strengthens his hand domestically.
And just looking forward, if he was to lose this vote and be forced to resign as Prime Minister, do you think that would affect the United Kingdom's position and actions to do with Ukraine or not?
I think the first thing to say is, even if he loses this vote, it's kind of up to him whether he resigns. And he has said repeatedly that he will not be resigning. He's going to sort of continue fighting. In the long term, it may be that his authority is weakened sufficiently that he's left with no choice but to resign at some point in the future, or he's sort of somehow forced out if his cabinet members start to turn their backs on him. But I mean, I think I don't anticipate a major change of British foreign policy, even if Boris Johnson isn't in the driving seat, because we've got huge public support for Ukraine and kind of public support against Russian aggression. The Conservative Party are fairly united on this, the opposition as well. It's kind of a broad consensus within the kind of UK domestic policy that we'd be wanting to sort of continue with the support for Ukraine. So even if the Prime Minister is ousted, we're unlikely to see a kind of sudden U-turn on our support for Ukraine.
Well, Camilla, thank you so much for joining. I know you've got probably an incredibly busy day ahead, so it's hugely appreciated that you could give us your time. Dom, I know you said you had some thoughts on this, and then we'll bring in James, who's also called in.
Yeah, well, just very briefly to say that we asked the Prime Minister of Estonia what the view might be if Boris Johnson is ousted, and she was pretty relaxed about it, to be perfectly honest. She said there'd be no different approach. She didn't anticipate any change in direction at all from the British government of whatever shape it is and whatever leadership it's got if Johnson goes. So she's not too concerned there. It is worth saying that actually she brought down her government over the weekend. On Saturday, she broke the coalition, or she kicked out 7. She got 15-member cabinet. She kicked out 7 from the Centre Party, which is a sort of Russia-leaning party, has been very close to Putin in the past, and they fell out over an education bill, but actually it was a lot of politics coming. So actually her government is currently in crisis. So she was very relaxed about that as well. But in terms of the overall unity of the West at the moment, she was fairly relaxed about her own politics, and we can talk about that a bit later. But very very nonplussed about the machinations here. After she left the interview, where I was in the embassy, she was heading straight in to see Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary, and to meet, or scheduled to meet, Boris Johnson later today. That may well have changed because of events that are happening, but it'd be strange for a scheduled head of state Prime Minister visit to be derailed by domestic politics. And I'm sure Boris Johnson will want to take the time to get away from it for a bit. So she's expecting to see Johnson later on today. But yeah, she was fairly relaxed about any upsetting the apple cart that his departure might herald.
Thanks very much, Dom. Let's bring in James Kilner now. James, thank you so much for joining. I know you wanted to speak about some of your own reporting in Estonia. Can you tell us about that? What did you find?
Well, thank you for having me. And you can hear me okay? I'm in Kazakhstan, Almaty. So everything's okay on the line?
Absolutely. We've got you loud and clear. Okay,
great. So about 10 days ago, I made my way up to a town on the Estonia-Russia border called Narva. And this has become a major gateway for refugees from Mariupol in southern Ukraine and also Kharkiv, who ended up being rescued, in inverted commas, by Russian forces and pushed into Russia. And I was sent up there by the Telegraph's foreign desk to speak to them and find out, listen to their story and how they ended up there and their trials and tribulations and difficulties along the way. So I spent about 3 days there interviewing, 25 refugees from Ukraine. And I learned basically about the Russian network, which is helping them through Russia, and the different filtration camps and sort of checks that the Russians are pushing on them to filter out people that they think might be a problem, people who are linked to the Ukrainian police, the Ukrainian military, this sort of thing. And it was about listening to them and their stories.
And from them, what really stood out to you? I mean, it's something I've noticed. We're getting a lot of questions for the podcast on, is people asking, can we say more about the people being sent to Russia and being filtrated through Russia? Could you give us more details on these camps and the kind of questions being asked?
Okay, so I'd say about 90% of the people I spoke to are from Mariupol and had spent between a month and 2.5 months hiding in basements from the bombing. And by the time they end up in Narva, they are shell-shocked. And you can see this straight away. Their eyes are sunken, they look thinner, their skin is more pallid, they look really quite shocked. And they're fully traumatized. And between leaving Mariupol after leaving Mariupol, they get sent to rebel-hold Donetsk region, where there's so-called filtration camps. And in the filtration camps, the Russians separate the men and the women. And it's at this point, these are dirty, poorly run camps, and there's disease-ridden and diarrhea is rife, etc. And at this point, the men are grilled for several hours, interviews, strips. The Russian soldiers are looking for tattoos, that sort of thing, which singles them out as being linked to the Ukrainian military. They have to swear an allegiance to Russia, and they have to pledge that they have had nothing to do with the Ukrainian military. If they get past that point, and many of the men don't, men can be siphoned off into prison at that point. If they get past that point, they get sent to something called a temporary accommodation point in Russia proper. So they leave the rebel-held bit of Donetsk and they go into Russia proper, and these are spread around Russia. There's a big one outside a city called Rostov-on-Don, which is in southern Russia, but they could get sent to several places. And it's at this point that the semi-underground network of Russian volunteers really kicks in, and they are able to give these refugees SIM cards and a bit of cash. These temporary accommodation points are gymnasiums, converted gymnasiums, that sort of thing, being with mattresses on the floor, and families can get together. I mean, they're still only semi-comfortable. But the refugees from Ukraine are actually free to leave these places. They're not obligated to stay. And you have to remember, a lot of the people who are living in Ukraine, especially Mariupol and Kharkiv, have very close relations dotted around Russia. Ukraine and Russia have very, sort of fully integrated in sort of familiar ways and linguistic, obviously. So many can peel off and try and stay with relatives. Some others get fully linked in with this network of semi-underground Russian volunteers and hit this escape route, if you like, out of Russia into the European Union, which has become fairly established. But then there's also another group of people, and it's a choice, who can take official refugee status from the Russian government. And if they choose this route, and some do, they are helped with their own housing and helped find a job, supposedly, and given a little bit of money, supposedly. Now, the refugees that I spoke to who'd come out into Narva, none of them had chosen this route, but they knew of people who had, and it sounds like there's so many strings attached to it that it's difficult to make work. The people who chose to become official refugee in Russia have to give up their Ukrainian citizenship altogether. They're sent to the Far East, Russia, places near Vladivostok. I mean, several time zones away, 6 time zones away from Moscow. Or they're sent to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea coast, where it is pretty remote as well. And they often end up housed in like wooden barrack-like conditions, given very manual jobs and not much pay. So that was sort of one of the first reports that we managed to get out in the West about people from Ukraine who take official refugee status in Russia. And then I was also able to report on this sort of escape route that this network of Russian volunteers have set up. And again, it was one of the first reports in English media about this network, who help the ones who choose who request to get into the European Union out of Russia, first to Moscow, and then to St. Petersburg, and then from St. Petersburg it's about 2.5 hour drive to the Estonian border, to a town called Ivangorod, and then you cross a bridge, and then you're into Estonia proper. And it's this network of volunteers that I was interested in finding out more about. When I was in Narva, there's a refuge there where a lot of the Ukrainian refugees, it's their first port of call. It's an old sort of, crumbling business centre, hasn't really been used for a while. It's sort of pre-Soviet era. And Narva, sorry, to put Narva into context a bit, it's a Stalin. Estonia used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And Narva had been destroyed in the Second World War by the Red Army. They rebuilt it. It looks like a Soviet town. If you know the former Soviet Union, it's this classic grid system, Stalin blocks, etc. 90% of the people there speak Russian, that sort of thing. So it's different from Estonia proper. And there was this building near the train station and the bus station used as a refuge centre where the refugees come for their first night inside the European Union once they leave Russia. And it's staffed by, a spillover of this volunteer network, often by Russians who are anti-war and fled Russia themselves 6 weeks, 2 months earlier. And out of a feeling of guilt and personal responsibility, they're manning this refuge and helping these people, these Ukrainians who have been displaced and their lives completely ruined in Mariupol. And it just so happened when I was there, one of the evenings I was hanging out there, most of the refugees turn up in the evening because especially the men on the Russian side of this border crossing, they get heavily interviewed by FSB officers. FSB is the Russian Secret Service, I suppose you could call it. And the men especially get heavily interviewed, for several hours. Again, the Russians are looking for anyone who may have links to the Ukrainian military, that sort of thing. So generally, it takes until late afternoon, early evening for the Ukrainian refugees to turn up. And I was hanging around there about 7 o'clock one evening, trying to talk to people, not be too intrusive because it's not the way I want to do things. And then in walked this young guy, turned out to be called Vlad, from Mariupol, 21 years old, and he'd been separated from his girlfriend at this filtration camp in Donetsk about 2 months earlier. He'd been kept behind, and his arm was covered in one of these tattoos, and he'd just been given a grilling at the border zone. And with him was this. The Russian border guards eventually let him over after four or 5 hours of interrogation. But with him was this wonderful Russian woman who was really bubbly, Yelena, vivacious woman. And she had a Finnish residency card, which allowed her to cross into Estonia. It's basically a closed border at the moment, except if you've got an Estonian passport or an EU passport out of there. But she had this Finnish residency card. So she was able to help Vlad get over the border sort of thing. And then she was going back into Russia. She's a Russian passport holder to be, do this whole thing. And she was part of this network. And she was able to give me a really interesting insight into how this network operates and how many people there are and what motivates them.
So just to ask, now these refugees have made it to Estonia, made it to the EU. Did they tell you much about what their plans are for the future? Are they going to stay there? Are they going to move around? What are they thinking?
So all the ones I spoke to on that trip to Narva, they all had a final destination in mind somewhere in Europe. None were heading to the UK. We've made it difficult. Most were heading to Germany. Vlad himself, his girlfriend had made it to Malmo, so he was heading over there in Sweden. Some was going to Croatia, France. None had plans at that stage to head back to Ukraine. They actually had nothing to go back to. If you're from Mariupol, you really have nothing to go back to. The same with the people from Kharkiv. But they were all moving on from Narva the next day. Narva was just a waypoint in their journey. It was their first step inside the European Union. Once inside the EU, they could travel around freely, well, in the Schengen area. Some were heading on to Tallinn and then onto the capital of Estonia and then on elsewhere. When I got back to Tallinn, I followed my story from Narva. And when I got to Tallinn, I did some more rooting around. And it turns out that a lot of them have stuck around in Estonia. And there's a great big cruise ship docked off the port in Tallinn. And it's full of refugees been given over to So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. And how that, I mean, Estonia is a very small country. It's got about 1.3 million people. There are a lot of pro-Russia sentiment there. When I say a lot, I mean, I found a bar on Sunday evening and it was full of Russian speakers, and half of them were supporting Putin's war in Ukraine and half weren't. So it's going to be very interesting to see the rub down and the shakeout with the refugees in Estonia and the complications that Estonia has right on the eastern border of NATO's eastern border of Russia.
James, can I just ask you a question while you're on? Great to have you. Thanks for dialing in. You said that the men were separated from families when they were taken into either the Russian separatist areas in Ukraine or Russia proper. If they then get through those interrogations and aren't arrested for former affiliations and what have you, at what point are the families reunited, or are they not? And the network you talk about, the Russian network to get these people out and back to well, somewhere else. The volunteers in that organisation, why have they chosen to stay? What was their motivation for staying rather than leaving themselves?
Yeah, good question, Storm. The families are generally reunited at these temporary accommodation points. So that's the stage after they leave Donetsk, which is the rebel-held area of Ukraine. They then are told to go to a certain temporary accommodation point in one of the towns or cities around Russia. And it's at that point that they can, they said, "Oh, your family's at this temporary accommodation point, go and rejoin your family." But they might be like 2 weeks behind or whatever. In the case of Vlad, his girlfriend had, these temporary accommodation points are not particularly comfortable. Fine, if you need to wait for a husband or boyfriend, great, you can stay there and wait for him. In the case of Vlad, his girlfriend had just moved on to Malmo and told him where she was going. As I said, the Ukrainians do have agency. They are free to come and go once they get past the filtration points. It's quite important, I think, for the Russian government to give that impression. Like I said, they can choose to take an official refugee status, but that comes with a lot of strings attached. They can stay at the temporary accommodation point for quite a long time if they want to, or they can go and stay with a relative in Russia, or they can get into this network of volunteers and get out of Russia through Narva, mainly through Narva. With the network of volunteers, which is incredibly interesting, and it's really, I can't stress how difficult it is to get insight into Russia these days. I've been working in the sort of virtual Moscow bureau of Natalia since the war started, basically tasked with trying to work out what's going on in Russia. And remotely, this is incredibly difficult. It's difficult enough when you're living there. So Yelena was one of the first people, I think, that had worked in this Russian network inside Russia and had been able to speak to Western journalists, i.e. me, in Narva. And she showed me this Telegram channel through which this network of volunteers is coordinated through. And there's about 5,000 of them in St. Petersburg, about 3,000 in Moscow, and she said there's several hundred in all the other cities around Russia. So it's a big network. She said they're very strict on the Telegram channels. There's absolutely no talk of politics, and anyone who's got an oppositionist profile in Russia, which is a very difficult thing to have, is not allowed on the Telegram channels, and is not allowed as part of this network of volunteers helping Ukrainian refugees, because if they did, that might compromise the whole network. And the main motivation is, I mean, they're giving the volunteers their own money, they're giving them their own clothes, because the refugees from Mariupol, they turn up with nothing. They just have the clothes that they've off the back and that they fled with, and a few suitcases. You see this when they turn up in Narva, and they have no access to money either. Their bank accounts don't work in Russia because Russia's now out of the SWIFT international banking system. They have no access to cash. So one of the main things volunteers do is buy their railway tickets. One family I spoke to, Mariupol, in Narva, had escaped from Mariupol in their car. They'd run the gauntlet. They'd left their basement and gone, right, let's get out of here. This is, I think they fled sort of mid-March time. It's terrifying, bombs going off all around them, artillery shots, etc. They managed to drive out. They got to Russia, and then they sold their car, not as a car, because they said no one wants a car of Ukrainian number plates from Russia now, but for spare parts. And they scraped together like $1,000, and that got them through. But most people had nothing. So they're reliant on volunteers to buy them tickets, etc., give them clothes. The volunteers themselves are motivated by a sense of real guilt about what their country's done to their neighbour. And sort of a human desire to help. A lot of people did flee Russia at the beginning of March. That was mainly driven by a fear that Putin was going to order a mass mobilization of men, and also a desire not to live in an authoritarian country where dissent is literally banned. But the people who did stay, and I do know middle-class people in Russia who did stay, they're trying to make it work for them as it is. And I think, talking to Yelena, this network of volunteers and speaking to other volunteers on the telephone, this is a way for them to sort of rationalize their life inside authoritarian Russia, if you see what I mean. And it gives them a sense of being useful in this terrible scenario, and a way of dealing with their own shame.
So just a final question from me, James. So just to be really clear, you mentioned how they're very careful not to discuss politics. They won't invite anybody into this Telegram channel who's an opposition politician or activist or anything. So they are doing everything within the law, and the only way they are able to sort of carry on and not be rolled up by the FSB is to avoid all that. Is that fair? So they don't talk politics. They just have to keep everything as legal as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So they absolutely don't talk politics, which is basically dissent is basically banned. They absolutely don't talk about the war because that literally is banned. And the way they organise themselves is pseudo-open but pseudo-closed. Like they don't talk to other people about it, and they accept that. And the Russian state is such a nefarious being, and so full of contradictions. There's always a way of getting something done in the former Soviet Union, and both sides know this. So the security services know this, and the volunteers know this, and there's always a line to tread. So they're trying to make a balance, and the security services are trying to watch them to make sure they don't go over that balance. They don't go over that line. And if they can find themselves to buying tickets for a Ukrainian or giving them some clothes, or in the case of Yelena, giving them a lift to the border and getting them over the border, they haven't crossed that line. Particularly, there's nothing illegal in that. That's just, buying a train ticket or giving someone a lift. But if they start briefing Western journalists on the telephone from St. Petersburg or Moscow, etc., about how terrible the Russian government is and how the volunteers are starting to gather politically against the government, then that is absolutely a bad thing to do, and they will get visited by the security services, and terrible things then might happen. So it's about getting that balance right. I was lucky that Yelena. We did, and I did speak to several activists, is the wrong word, volunteers inside Russia about this. No, they were all very coy about talking to me from inside Russia. There was a little bit of this, passed around a bit, and they said, well, we do a little bit of that, a little bit of this, but they were very unspecific. But it was only because Yelena was standing in Estonia and talking to me face to face that we were able to really discuss their work, if you sort of thing.
It does sound fascinating. As you're speaking there, James, it was just echoing for me the various books and bits and pieces I've learnt about the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. This was set up to keep the fight going when Britain had been shoved off the mainland Europe. And the SOE was these small cells, native speakers who could go into various countries, mainly France and sort of the European theatre, but it was in the Eastern theatre as well, to raise local militia. It wasn't just an intelligence gathering organisation. It was there to conduct sabotage and what have you. So I'm not suggesting this group are getting anywhere near that, but just the basic cellular structure whereby each network was a very small number of individuals, so that if anybody was compromised, and they were interrogated or tortured, they wouldn't give up too many other people in other networks. And also, if they were infiltrated, they couldn't be discovered. And it's just there's real parallels there. I'm amazed you got as much out of them as you did, because these things, from what little I know, sort of live or die on their internal security. And if anyone's interested in the SOE, I suggest you go and read M.R.D. Foot's book about historian M.R.D. Foot, wrote a book about the Special Operations Executive. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And it would be really interesting to see how this group develops throughout this war, and whether or not these are the euphoric early days, and they're talking to journalists, and that's great. But it's also a little bit. It doesn't come without its dangers, and I just wonder if these are the early days and they're going to settle down. They're going to sort of learn from their own mistakes and from their own successes, and evolve into some kind of cellular structure. This network. No, it'd be really interesting. We'll have to tie up with you as things develop.
I think that's I think that is interesting. I think it's really important to distinguish between this network of volunteers who are really trying to stay away from giving the impression that they're opposition activists. They may be motivated by shame and anti-war feelings, but they're not trying to push it too hard. And then they are using semi-open Telegram channels, etc. And sort of more sort of cell-like groups of genuine opposition activists who are trying to do that sort of thing. We have done reports about military recruitment centres in Russia being firebombed in Molotov cocktails, etc., and railway lines being sabotaged, and that is very much the sort of is exactly what you're talking about. These sort of hardcore activists who are trying to change the course of the war. You see what I mean? The volunteers are just trying to get the refugees out at this point.
James, one tiny question from me. Does the organisation have a name? What do they call themselves? It's almost like the sort of Underground Railroad or something.
No, I think they just call volunteers. I think it's if they do have a name, I don't know what it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining this call and sharing your reporting with us, James. Is there anything you'd want our listeners to understand or know before we move on to hearing what Dom learnt from the Estonian Prime Minister?
No, I think that's all really. I mean, about the network of volunteers and the refugees themselves, it's all in my online story. Did another story in today's paper about the other side of the coin, which I'll give you 20 seconds of, about the passionately pro-war, pro-Putin group in Russia who are crowdfunding kit for their military, their soldiers on the front line. And, this group full of Zeds, the insignia of the pro-war lot, are buying, they're spending their own money buying drones, telescopic sights, boots, etc., etc. So Russia really is full of, as we all know, contradictions and different parties.
Well, thank you very much, James Kilner, and please feel free to stay and listen and join back in the chat when you'd like. Dom Nicholls, can I move to you? You spoke to the Estonian Prime Minister earlier. What did she have to say?
Well, she had to say an awful lot, and I haven't got time to cover it all here. I'll try and talk about it at the correct times over the next few days. But just to take up the point there that James mentioned about the deportation, she was very clear on this. And she talked about her own experience of her mother, Prime Minister's mother was deported as a 6-year-old baby to Siberia in 1949. And she said, she was talking in the context of calls for ceasefire and Macron's comments about shouldn't humiliate Putin, what have you. And she said, I'm going to read the whole quote because it speaks for it. I don't need to try and interpret for you. But she said, I'm very worried about the premature calls for ceasefire or peace calls, because it doesn't mean that if there is a peace, the atrocities will end for those territories that are occupied. And I speak from experience of my own country. We had peace after the Second World War. It didn't mean that the atrocities stopped. The deportations only started then. My own mother was deported as a 6-month-old baby to Siberia in 1949. All of this happened in the occupied territories while the West lived in the illusion that there was peace and everything is fine. Everything is fine. There were mass killings, there was torture, there were deportations. And she said, if there is premature peace or a premature ceasefire, the aggression will return and the atrocities will not stop. God, I'm mangling my words today, I'm sorry. We've already made the mistake 3 times if you think about Georgia, Donbass and Crimea, and we cannot make this mistake again. So she was really, really clear that this is just any early peace, early calls for peace is a misnomer. And actually the embassy spokesperson that helped us there said that her grandfather was deported as a 15-year-old boy to Russia during the war, and he managed actually to escape and come back. But I got the impression, and she was off to see Boris Johnson and Ben Wallace and what have you, so we didn't have a chance to really develop it. But I got the impression, and I'd love to hear from our Estonian listeners and anyone with more experience and knowledge on this than me, which is basically anybody listening. I didn't realise that the deportations during and after the Second World War, when Estonia was part of the Soviet Union, was such a huge cultural issue. I was aware of it, but I didn't know it was such a formative experience, and I would like to learn more about that. I think we should do, and I think the Prime Minister was making the point that there's a lot being taken for granted by others in the West and NATO and the EU, and she was critical of Macron and his mildly critical, not within the bounds of I've got a great story here, a great scoop, but she was just saying she thought it wasn't great language to be using, and just thought the whole concept of coming at too early a peace. I know that sounds horrific because we want the fighting to stop, but she made the point that President Zelensky said that if Russia stops the fighting, then there's peace. If Ukraine stops fighting, then there's no more Ukraine. So she was saying that this has to be handled correctly. And she said that her worry of Macron talking to Putin was that Russia would give the feeling that they are winning some people over and they will forgive us all. That's a quote: winning some people over and they'll forgive us all. She said that's classic negotiation tactics of what they're doing. It's very, very worrying. And that at the moment these comments and these efforts are just misguided. They are leaving the West in one way and being received in Russia in quite another. And she was suggesting that Putin's taking succor from some big hitters in the West. And she mentioned Macron by name, but as I say, it wasn't a big political dig. She wasn't that daft. But she was just making the point that there were some big voices making some calls, possibly not realising the historical interpretation or the way they're going to be received in Russia. And I thought that was very, very, very interesting. So you're about to come in there.
Oh, no, not at all. Were you about to carry on?
Well, yeah. So
please.
Moving on from there, she was saying that it's too premature now to talk about a ceasefire. She said we have to isolate Russia politically, economically, and we have to be prepared for the long war. And I asked her, right, well, who do you think, or how many are not prepared for this long war? And she just scribbling at my notes, looking at my notes here. She said that it's all down to. She wasn't going to name names. She said she wasn't going to name names, but it was straight after the context about Macron and what have you. She said we all have different historical perspectives, and we can only speak about our own experiences. But she said, this is a quote, "Our worry is that the West was doing well in the 50 years," this is after the Second World War, "the West was doing well in the 50 years where we were occupied and you were living well on your side of the wall. As the experience is not there, we have to be very vocal about what will come." So she's saying that the West, we just don't have this experience of being occupied and the deportations. And she said that at let me get the figures right. Just so I'm not totally, bluffing you. In 1922, the Russian minority in Estonia was 3.2%. They deported a load of Estonians and imported Russians to the country of Estonia. So by the end of the Soviet occupation, as she called it, the Russian minority was over 30%. And she said, this is all happening now in Ukraine, and that's why we are very worried, she said. So, I mean, the numbers, those are staggering figures, 3.2 to 30% through this system of deportations. And exactly as James has been saying, that we're seeing that now. A lot of Ukrainians have great family ties to Russia, so many will stay. So this is, if not history repeating itself, then certainly the classic sort of echo through time. But she was very, very vocal about the West needs to get itself sorted out. She was talking also about Nato Summit, the end of June, 28th to the 30th of June in Madrid. This will be the big summit where it's almost a certainty that Finland and Sweden will be given the thumbs up to join. A bit of wrangling with Turkey to happen between now and then, but yeah, that's going to happen. But she said this is also the Madrid summit will also be the moment when NATO needs to move from a tripwire concept to a forward defence concept. And what she was saying was that it's all very well NATO having the enhanced forward presence mission, so across the Baltic states and actually now down into the Black Sea states as well. So an increased number of troops. For example, Britain has a battle group, about 700 people in Estonia at all times now. And that is a tripwire. So it's basically reinforcing Article 5, NATO's Article 5, saying to Russia, you step over here. It's not just a treaty violation, but you've then got British soldiers as well as Estonians, and there's Americans and French and all other countries have contributed in some degree. And she's saying that's fine, but a tripwire goes off when the aggressor arrives, and she said we don't want that. So she's talking about this idea that's coming to the fore in NATO of having a forward defence concept, i.e. basically rearming and going hard, putting a really firm presence along the eastern border of NATO, and also having it backed up in all sorts of exercises and policy obligations, and a very obvious, an overt presence such that should anything happen, should Russia, should Putin try chance his luck against a NATO country, there'll be a very swift and overwhelming and unequivocal response. But yeah, just to finish off, she was very, very firm that now's not the time to lean back or take the foot off the accelerator regarding Ukraine, and also weapons supplies. As I said, she said that she believes that Russia trying to frame the issue of weapons delivery as escalatory and provocative. She said this is a trap. Ukraine's done nothing to cause a situation. She said there should be no efforts at all to try and to look for off-ramps or to save face for Putin. She said he can save his own face. He's invaded another country. He can save his face by turning around. She said, I don't really like the calls that Putin's in a corner. He's not in a corner. Or if he is in a corner, it's of his own making. He can very well go back to his own country, whereas Ukrainians have nowhere to go. It's their home. So she's very, very firm on this. And just reiterated, just at the end, she was saying, what is our neighbour's problem today is our problem tomorrow. If our neighbour's house is on fire, then we should all be concentrating on putting out that fire rather than saying, aren't we glad that the fire is not here? So she's in now. Hopefully she's seen Ben Wallace. Hopefully she's seen Boris Johnson. And very, very, very fulsome support for Ukraine and an even tougher Western response coming from the Prime Minister of Estonia.
Well, thanks for that, Dom. That sounds fascinating. Look forward to reading that soon. Time is marching on, so I just got to ask both of you, Dom and James, for your final thoughts. What should our listeners be looking for over the next few days?
Excuse me. Well, I think the Estonia government thing's important to look out for. As far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, we did a nice little story published in today's newspaper about Lavrov having problems flying to Serbia. The neighbouring countries to Serbia blocked his airspace, which has kind of humiliated him. He's a travel-loving, long-standing foreign minister for Russia, so that would frustrate him. And obviously, we did a story as well yesterday about this new arms, these new missiles that Britain is now sending to Ukraine, along with the US, have a range of about 50 or 60 miles. Putin said yesterday that he would strike new targets, in quotation marks, if these missiles are delivered. Dom will have much more information than me on when these would be delivered, but I'd imagine now is very much something to look out for.
Yeah, that'd be my final thought there. I mean, the old phrase is better late than never. So, well, really, in terms of Ukraine, we're about to have that properly tested, because these multiple launch rocket systems that, as James says, have about an 80k range. If they'd been there now for this fight in the Donbass, they you can never say with any great certainty with war, but they would have had a big effect, I think, and whether or not the war as it is at the moment is going to be in the position, and it does seem to be calcifying to a certain degree. The lines aren't changing much. There are mini counter-offensive or counter-attacks, but no great push. If the lines are where they are today, in a few months' time, then these weapons might have an effect. But it's going to take a few weeks for the Ukrainian troops to be trained on them. Britain said that we're going to train Ukrainian troops in Britain on the MLRS. But it's going to take weeks before they are operating in Ukraine, and I just hope that it's not too late. So Ukraine have been very clear about what they want. They've been very, very thankful for anything that they've been receiving, but they've been clear for weeks now, and this shouldn't have taken anyone by surprise. They were after long-range artillery to push the Russian artillery back, so that firstly they can't smash up civilian areas and kill a huge amount of people, but also then the Russians' armour and infantry cannot operate under this blanket of artillery, and they've shown themselves very vulnerable to the Ukrainian anti-tank teams and infantry tactics. So if these things had been there now, they could have had an effect. Whether they'll be in a position, whether the war will be in a position for them to have such a significant effect in a few weeks' time, and that's being generous, probably a few months' time when they are there and operating. I hope so, and I hope we don't come to live to regret the phrase "better late than never."
Last week, I spoke to Nasta Nasko, a 23-year-old Belarusian who's mobilised a group of volunteers who've raised almost £600,000. That's over $700,000 to our American listeners, for the Ukrainian army and other charity groups. The volunteers call themselves Tear Only fans, and their tactic for encouraging donations is a little unorthodox. Here's my conversation with Nasta, and just a note from me that she uses some language that some listeners might find offensive. Well, Nasta, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for talking to us. Could you give us a sense of your life before the war? Where are you from, and what did you do?
Originally, I'm from Belarus, but I moved to Ukraine 3 years ago because of job offer. And these 3 years, I lived in Kiev, I work in Kiev, I had friends in Kiev, I even married in Kiev, so my life was whole in Ukraine. I was working, and I'm still working at We Play Esports. It's a tournament and organization of esports events. And I had really good life until the war.
So let's talk about the war. What happened in the first week? How did you react? How did your life change?
To be honest, I'm very lucky because I went to Croatia for vacation, I think at 18th February, and I woke up in Zagreb when the war has been started. I was really afraid because I didn't know what should I do. There were no planes, no trains to Ukraine. I couldn't return to the country. As I remember, at the first day, Belarusian and Russian people wasn't allowed to come to Ukraine, even permanent residents, as like me, for example. So I decided firstly to stay in Croatia and started to help people as a volunteer because I had not huge, but I think big audience in Twitter. That's why I tried to find, for example, cars from Kiev for more safe cities. I tried to collect money for our army, for volunteers, for people that lost their jobs and etc. Then I thought that my mom is Polish and my friend from Ukraine could brought my pets. I had a dog and a cat to Poland. That's why now I'm staying in Poland and waiting when the war will be ended.
So you're on vacation. You started off by helping out as much as you could in Croatia. You're now in Poland. So let's talk about OnlyFans. Could you explain very basically what it is? And then we can ask, how did you come up with the idea? Where does this come from?
Yeah, sure. As I said, I had audience in Twitter and I tried to help people by my audience. I saw the message, the tweet from stranger. I even didn't know this person. He wanted to escape from Kharkov because it was very attacked by a Russian army. And I made a tweet that I'm looking for a car for this person. There were a lot of retweets, a lot of likes, a lot of replies, but no car. That's why I thought that it would be great to tweet in feed and just wrote that I will send my nude photo for the person who will find the car for this person. To be honest, it's really funny. The car have been found in 5 minutes, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So he got out. He got out of Kharkiv.
Yeah. And
so then you realised you were onto something, that worked.
To be honest, when I woke up next morning, I got about 80 messages from my followers like, oh, we couldn't help you with car, but we can send you money for your nude photo. I had work and I have salary. That's why I don't need money from Ukrainian people that have stayed in Ukraine. And I said, I will send you this photo, but donate to army. And I think in 3 days, I got more than 300 requests for this new photo from different people for donation for the army. And then me and my friend that, as I said, brought my animals to Poland, we realized that we can earn money for army directly. We didn't take any money for our own cards, bills, and etc. We realized that it's a good idea. If people like it, why not? And we created this OnlyFans, and people started to donate, to write us. Yeah, that's it. OnlyFans, it's a game of the words like territorial defense and OnlyFans. We don't use OnlyFans, but we call us Nude Army of Ukraine. That's why we choose
the Nude Army of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And how many are now in your Nude Army then?
As I remember, we have 35 people. 30 from them are women and 5 of them are men. And we have 10 total anonymous people that just send us their nude photos and say, yeah, you can use it, you can send it to other people. If it helps Ukraine, why not?
So you're a Twitch gamer. So you do competitive gaming. What are the backgrounds of the other people in this group? And how do you guys know each other? Was it all through Twitter? Was it social media?
No. I didn't know these people. I just knew my friend that is living with me. She's also nice as me. And people just follow the hashtag OnlyFans in Twitter and thought, it's really great idea. I can help also. They started to write me, and when we're more than 30 people, I thought that we need to gather together and create a chat where we can collect screenshots of payment to Ukrainian army, and that's how it started.
So what kind of groups are you raising money for? So it's the army, it's some charities. Could you give us an idea?
We raised money, as I said, for army, for volunteers, for local territorial defense, for example, in Vinnytsia. In first days, we tried to send money to Azov in Mariupol, but as you know, it was kind of difficult. And also we helped Ukrainian zoos by buying tickets to these zoos to save animals. And as I remember, we donated to some animal shelters. I'm really keen on animals. I appreciate animals. That's why I couldn't left them with help.
And how much money have you raised so far now for all the different organizations?
As I remember, more than $600,000.
$600,000
Yeah.
worth of donations raised from nude pictures from your Nude Army.
Yeah. It started at the 8th of March. In International Women's Day, we wrote that it will be the best gift the victory of Ukraine. So you can donate money, and it will be the best gift for us in this Women's Day.
Have you encountered any criticism or reaction? Some people might say it's a kind of form of exploitation. You shouldn't be put in a position where you have to share photos of yourself like this to raise money. How do you respond to that?
To be honest, I hadn't got a lot of negative comments, about maybe 10, and all of them were from Russians, unfortunately. But I think that people firstly laugh from it, and then they understand that it raised a lot of money, and they started to respect us and don't think that we are like kind of whores or OnlyFans girls. They understand that we're doing right and we're helping our country. To be honest, it's even not my country, it's not my hometown, but I want to live here after the war ends, and it's my main aim right now to collect as much money as we can to protect Ukraine from Russian army.
So when you think of all the money that you've raised, like what kind of emotion do you feel proud of it? Do you feel empowered? Like this is your way of making a difference?
Firstly, I was a little bit ashamed because I have never posted nude photos, or I didn't even get OnlyFans. I just stream on Twitch. And I was a little bit ashamed because I was afraid that people should talk something bad about me. But then I understand that it's a really good and big deal. And I was very proud. Even my employer said that it's a very good activity, very good foundation, I can say. And it makes me really proud. And also I'm very proud that people in Ukraine gather different ways and support each other. It's much better than all this money that we have collected.
And what kind of reaction have you got from the Ukrainian armed forces or the people that you're helping?
A lot of people that are in army right now, they send us videos with words of thanks. They even recorded us Ukrainian songs, Ukrainian poems to support us, to make us more happy. And they usually send us reports, what did they buy because of this money. And it's the best words of thanks, I think.
So just on that, what kind of things are they buying? Can you say, we send this many nude photos and they bought this equipment? What are the armed forces buying with your money?
Body armors, for example, because there were deficits of this in very hot spots. Also, they buy food, they buy medicaments. I'm really not good at army stuff, but as I remember, they buy copters to think enemies.
Like drones?
Sorry.
Oh, wow, okay.
And thermal images.
So thermal imaging cameras, drones. Is there anything offensive? Are they buying guns or ammunition? Or it's body armor, drones?
I don't think that they could buy guns because it's not allowed in Ukraine, but we donate a lot of money to the most well-known foundation in Ukraine, Back Alive. And they buy guns, they buy all this stuff from Europe and different countries. It's not, we didn't know about it, but we understand that they did it.
So this project sort of started out as a bit of a joke, and it's really, it's continued and it's got incredibly big. And you've said over $600,000 have been raised for all these different foundations. What's the future for you now? Where does this go? And when does this stop?
It will be stopped when Putin will die. And firstly, it was a joke, but right now I understand that it's a really good and a little bit creative project, but I hope that it will be stopped in the last day of the war, because we wouldn't have a need to donate money for army and volunteers when the peace will come.
Is there anything we haven't spoken about, or anything that you want to say, any message to the listeners? Because I'm aware that quite a few of our listeners, probably this might be the first time they've heard of OnlyFans or heard of the kind of stuff you're doing. What would you want to tell them?
I wanted to say that war isn't ended, it's continued. And I will be really happy if European people donate money directly to army, to volunteers. I will be really happy if people support Ukraine in these dark times, and don't forget that war is continuing right now in the center of the Europe. And also I'm really grateful for all European and all the world that supports Ukrainian refugees like me, like a lot of other people. We are very grateful, and we will be happy to see you in Ukraine after the victory.
And what does your future look like at the moment in Poland?
To be honest, my future is a little bit in shade. I have no idea where should I go, because I couldn't allow it to come back to Ukraine right now. I couldn't come back to Belarus because it's still dictator at power, at government, and I think I will be in prison if I come back to Belarus, because I collected a lot of money to army of other country, and it will be judged if I come back. That's why I will stay in Poland, try to get permanent residence here, because my mom is Polish and I had an opportunity to get it. And then when the war will be ended, I will come back to Ukraine, continue to work for my company and live my best life in Ukraine.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.